My name is Emma Thompson, and 3 months ago, I won $38 million in the lottery. But instead of celebrating, I made a decision that would expose the shocking truth about my own family. I told absolutely no one about the money. Instead, I created a fake financial crisis and asked each family member for help with $4,500. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. 7 family members who had borrowed thousands from me over the years. 7 people who claimed to love me unconditionally. But when I needed them most, only one person stepped up, and their response will bring you to tears. The others? Their reactions revealed something so disturbing about human nature that it changed my life forever. If you're watching this, drop a comment and let me know where you're viewing from. Before I tell you about this life-changing experiment that exposed my family's true colors, hit like and subscribe to hear more real stories about loyalty, betrayal, and the shocking things people do when they think no one is watching. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at your own family the same way again. Before that Tuesday evening in March, my life was perfectly ordinary in the most exhausting way possible. I'm Emma Thompson, 29 years old, and I worked as a graphic designer at Creative Solutions Agency here in Denver. My days were filled with demanding clients, impossible deadlines, and a boss, Mr. Peterson, who seemed to believe that sleep was optional for his employees. My one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill was small but cozy, though the rent kept climbing every year while my salary remained frustratingly stagnant. I had given up my dreams of being a fine artist years ago, trading my paintbrushes for computer screens and corporate logos. The steady paycheck felt more important than creative fulfillment, especially when I was constantly worried about making ends meet. My family situation was complicated, to put it mildly. My parents, Linda and Robert Thompson, divorced when I was 16. The split was messy, filled with arguments about money and custody that left lasting scars on all of us kids. Mom remarried Michael, an insurance salesman who treated her well, but always made it clear that his financial priorities lay with his own children from his first marriage. Dad found love with Sarah, a real estate agent who had expensive tastes and strong opinions about how everyone else should live their lives. I have 2 siblings who couldn't be more different from each other. My younger sister Ashley, 26, had always been the family success story. She graduated from business school, married a successful engineer named Chris, and now lived in a gorgeous house in the suburbs with their twin boys. Ashley was the golden child who could do no wrong, the one everyone pointed to as proof that hard work pays off. Then there's my older brother Brandon, 32, who despite his intelligence and charm, seemed incapable of getting his life together. He bounced between jobs, relationships, and cities with alarming frequency. Brandon had mastered the art of the desperate phone call, always needing money for rent, car repairs, or some new business venture that was guaranteed to make him rich. Over the years, I'd lent him thousands of dollars that I never saw again. My extended family added their own layers of complexity. Uncle Kevin, Dad's younger brother, worked in construction and struggled with alcoholism. Aunt Patricia, Mom's sister, was a single mother raising 3 kids on a teacher's salary. Then there was my cousin Tyler, Uncle Kevin's son, who at 28 still lived at home and seemed content to drift through life without any real direction or ambition. The one constant in my life was my best friend Jessica Williams. We'd met in college and somehow managed to maintain our friendship despite the chaos of adult life. Jessica worked as a social worker and understood struggle in a way that kept me grounded. She was the person I called when family drama became overwhelming, the voice of reason when I started to doubt my own perceptions. Buying lottery tickets had become my small weekly rebellion against financial stress. Every Wednesday, I'd stop at Frank's corner store and spend $15 on tickets. Frank, the elderly owner, always joked about my investment strategy, but there was something hopeful about those tickets. They represented possibility in a life that often felt predetermined by circumstances beyond my control. My family loved to tease me about this habit. Ashley called it throwing money away, while Brandon suggested I should just give him the cash directly since it would be put to better use. Dad would lecture me about probability and statistics, reminding me that I had better odds of being struck by lightning. But those tickets were mine, a small piece of hope that cost less than a dinner out. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days creating marketing materials for other people's dreams while my own artistic aspirations gathered dust in a closet. I kept my old paintings hidden away, reminders of a time when I believed creativity could pay the bills. Now, my artistic energy went into corporate brochures and website banners, functional but soulless work that paid the rent, but left me feeling empty. March 15th started like any other Tuesday. I'd spent the day wrestling with a particularly difficult client who wanted their logo redesigned for the fourth time, each iteration moving further away from anything resembling good design. By evening, I was exhausted and frustrated, ready for nothing more than takeout dinner and mindless television. I almost forgot to check my lottery numbers. It was only when I was getting ready for bed that I remembered the ticket sitting on my kitchen counter. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the lottery website, expecting the usual disappointment. The first number matched, then the second. By the fourth matching number, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. When all 6 numbers aligned perfectly with my ticket, I stared at the screen in complete disbelief. The jackpot was $38 million. According to the website, I was the sole winner. After taxes, I'd receive approximately $22 million, more money than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams. The winning numbers were 03-12, -18, -25, -31, -42. Each one held special meaning. The day I'd sold my first painting, my college graduation date, the month I'd moved to Denver, and other milestones from my abandoned art career. It felt like the universe was telling me something, though I wasn't sure what. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I spent that entire sleepless night staring at the lottery website, refreshing the page over and over again, convinced that somehow the numbers would change. They didn't. By 3 a.m., I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my laptop, frantically researching what happens to lottery winners. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Story after story of lives destroyed by sudden wealth, families torn apart by greed and entitlement, winners who went bankrupt within 5 years, not from poor spending habits, but from the endless stream of relatives, friends, and strangers who felt entitled to their money. One article particularly haunted me. The Lottery Curse: Why 70% of Winners End Up Broke and Alone. I read about a woman in Florida whose own mother sued her for half the winnings, claiming she had promised to share any jackpot. A man in Ohio whose brother kidnapped his children and demanded ransom money from the lottery winnings. Countless stories of people who discovered that everyone they loved suddenly had a sob story and an outstretched hand. As dawn broke over Denver, I made a decision that would change everything. I would claim the money, but I wouldn't tell anyone. Not my family, not even Jessica. I needed time to think, to plan, to understand what this money meant before everyone else tried to tell me what to do with it. The next morning, I called in sick to work and made an appointment with Catherine Mills, an attorney specializing in estate planning and asset protection. Her office was in downtown Denver, a sleek high-rise that made me feel completely out of place in my jeans and anxiety. "Miss Thompson," Catherine greeted me with a professional smile. She was in her 40s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confidence that comes from years of handling delicate financial matters. "What can I help you with today?" I placed the lottery ticket on her mahogany desk with trembling hands. "I need to claim this without anyone knowing it was me." Her eyebrows rose slightly as she examined the ticket, but her expression remained professional. "I see. Well, You've come to the right place. Colorado allows lottery winners to claim prizes through legal entities, which can protect your privacy indefinitely. Over the next 3 hours, Catherine explained the process of setting up a trust, the tax implications, and the importance of assembling a team of financial advisors. The biggest mistake winners make, she told me, leaning back in her leather chair, is telling people before they're prepared for the consequences. Once that information is out there, there's no taking it back. How long do I have to decide? I asked. You have 180 days to claim the prize, but I'd recommend making the claim sooner rather than later, just to secure the funds. Setting up the proper legal structures can take several weeks. I nodded, overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. What about taxes? Federal taxes will take about 37% right off the top, plus state taxes. You're looking at roughly $22 million take home. Still a life-changing amount, but important to plan accordingly. As I left Catherine's office with a folder full of documents and next steps, I felt a strange mix of excitement and isolation. I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of, but I couldn't share the news with anyone. I was living a double life before I'd even claimed the prize. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Catherine to establish the Mountain View Trust, a legal entity that would claim the winnings on my behalf. We set up investment accounts, created a comprehensive financial plan, and established protocols for accessing funds without raising suspicions. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was secretly becoming a multimillionaire, I was still going to work every day, still complaining about Mr. Peterson's impossible deadlines, still eating ramen noodles for lunch to save money. My colleagues had no idea that the woman struggling to make photocopies work properly had enough money to buy the entire building. The secrecy was harder than I'd anticipated. When Jessica complained about her student loan payments over coffee, I wanted desperately to tell her that I could pay them off without even noticing the expense. When my neighbor mentioned struggling with her medical bills, I had to bite my tongue to keep from offering help. But it was the interactions with my family that really tested my resolve. During our weekly family dinner at Mom's house, I listened to the usual complaints and financial stress with new ears. Brandon mentioned needing money for his car registration. Ashley talked about the expense of the boys' soccer equipment. Uncle Kevin complained about overtime hours just to make ends meet. Everyone had money problems, and for the first time in my life, I had the power to solve them all. But something held me back. Maybe it was the research I'd done about lottery winners, or maybe it was years of being the family's unofficial bank with nothing to show for it. I needed to understand who these people really were before I made any life-changing decisions. That's when the idea first occurred to me. What if I could test their loyalty before revealing my windfall? What if I could see who would be there for me when I had nothing to offer in return? The plan began forming slowly, almost subconsciously. I would create a financial crisis, something believable but serious enough to require help. I would approach each family member with the same story, the same request, and see who stepped up. Only then would I know who deserved to be part of my new life. I spent days crafting the perfect scenario. It had to be believable, urgent, but not so dramatic that it would raise suspicions. Finally, I settled on a story. I would tell them that Creative Solutions Agency was closing due to a major client lawsuit, leaving me without a job or final paycheck. I would say I needed $4,500 to cover rent and emergency expenses while I searched for new work. It was a significant amount, but not unreasonable. More importantly, it was an amount that most of my family members could afford if they chose to help. Ashley and Chris had savings, Mom and Michael had their dual incomes, Dad and Sarah had their real estate investments. Even Brandon, despite his chaotic lifestyle, had mentioned receiving a settlement from a car accident earlier that year. As I finalized my plan, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of me hoped I was wrong about my family, that they would surprise me with their generosity and support, But a larger part of me suspected that this experiment would confirm my worst fears about the people I'd spent my life trying to please. The night before I planned to make my first call, I sat in my apartment looking at my bank statements. In a few weeks, I would have access to $22 million. But first, I needed to find out what my relationships were really worth. I made a list of everyone I planned to contact, predicting their responses based on years of experience with each of them. Then I picked up my phone and prepared to discover the truth about my family. The weight of my secret was becoming unbearable. Every family interaction felt like I was wearing a mask, pretending to be the same struggling graphic designer while sitting on a fortune that could change all our lives. But the research I'd done about lottery winners kept echoing in my mind. I needed to know who my family really was before I made any irreversible decisions. I spent hours thinking about my history with each family member, cataloging every time they'd asked for help and every time I'd needed support in return. The pattern was depressingly clear. I had been the family's unofficial emergency fund for years, always ready to help with rent, car repairs, medical bills, or whatever crisis had emerged. But when I thought about times I'd needed help, the silence was deafening. 3 years ago, when I'd been hospitalized with pneumonia and couldn't work for 2 weeks, not one family member had offered financial assistance with my medical bills. I'd emptied my savings account and put the rest on credit cards. When my car broke down last year, leaving me stranded and unable to afford repairs, I'd taken out a personal loan rather than ask family for help, knowing from experience that it would either be refused or come with lectures about financial responsibility. The most painful memory was from 5 years ago, when I'd been laid off from my previous job. I'd spent 3 months looking for work, burning through my savings, and falling behind on rent. I'd finally swallowed my pride and asked Mom for a loan of $2,000 to avoid eviction. Her response still stung. "Emma, honey, you need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. This is just part of growing up." Meanwhile, just 6 months later, I'd given Brandon $3,500 for what he claimed was a security deposit on an apartment. He'd actually used it to pay off gambling debts, something I only discovered when he drunkenly confessed at Christmas dinner 2 years later. As I sat in my apartment that Friday evening, I made lists of every family member and their financial situations. Ashley and Chris had a household income of over $150,000 and owned their home outright. Mom and Michael both worked steady jobs and had recently renovated their kitchen. Dad and Sarah were successful in real estate and frequently posted photos of their weekend getaways to Aspen and Vail. Even Brandon, despite his chaotic lifestyle, had mentioned receiving a $12,000 settlement from a fender bender earlier that year. Uncle Kevin worked construction and overtime regularly, while Aunt Patricia, despite being a single mother, had managed to save enough to take her kids to Disney World last summer. The amount I planned to request, $4,500, was significant, but not unreasonable for any of them. More importantly, it was a fraction of what I'd lent to various family members over the years. If they truly cared about me, if our relationships were based on genuine love rather than convenience, at least some of them would find a way to help. I decided to share my plan with Jessica, needing at least one person to know what I was doing. We met for coffee at our usual spot, a small cafe near her office. As I explained my situation, leaving out the lottery win but describing the family test, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "Emma, this feels manipulative," she said, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "Why not just have honest conversations with them about how you feel?" "Because honesty hasn't worked," I replied. "I've tried talking to them about feeling taken advantage of, about the one-sided nature of our relationships. They either get defensive or dismiss my concerns entirely." Jessica leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "But lying to test people, that's not like you. What are you really trying to prove?" I stared out the cafe window at the Denver skyline, trying to articulate feelings I'd been carrying for years. I'm tired of being everyone's backup plan. I'm tired of being the person they call when they need something but ignore when I need support. I want to know who actually sees me as family versus who sees me as a resource. And what if they all fail your test? What then? The question hung in the air between us. I hadn't fully considered the possibility that everyone would disappoint me, though deep down, I suspected that's exactly what would happen. Then at least I'll know where I stand, I said finally, and I can make decisions about my relationships based on reality instead of hope. Jessica shook her head but didn't argue further. I think you're pushing yourself too hard with this, but I can see you've already made up your mind. She was right. Over the weekend, I crafted my story with meticulous care. Creative Solutions Agency would be closing due to a major lawsuit from a client who claimed our marketing campaign had damaged their brand. The company would be declaring bankruptcy, leaving employees without final paychecks or severance packages. I would say that I'd already been looking for new work, but that the job market was competitive, especially for graphic designers. My emergency fund had been depleted by unexpected dental work earlier in the year, leaving me unable to cover April's rent and basic expenses. I needed $4,500 to avoid eviction and maintain my health insurance until I found new employment. The story was believable because it contained elements of truth. The company did have difficult clients, the job market was competitive, and I had recently had dental work done. The lies were woven seamlessly into a fabric of reality that would be difficult to question. I made a prediction list of how each family member would respond. Ashley would express sympathy, but claim she and Chris were saving for the boys' college funds. Mom would offer emotional support, but say that helping financially would set a bad precedent. Dad would lecture me about emergency funds and suggest I find a roommate to reduce expenses. Brandon would promise to help but never follow through. Uncle Kevin would say he was between jobs himself. Aunt Patricia would genuinely want to help, but claim she couldn't afford such a large amount. Only one person gave me hope, though I tried to keep my expectations realistic even with her. The night before I planned to start making calls, I sat on my small balcony overlooking the city lights. Somewhere out there were offices managing investment portfolios worth billions, people making decisions about money that would affect thousands of lives. In a few weeks, I would join their ranks in a way, responsible for managing wealth I'd never dreamed of possessing. But first, I needed to understand the true nature of my relationships. I needed to know who would stand by me when I had nothing to offer but myself. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to discover who my real family was by pretending to be in the exact financial situation I'd been in my entire adult life. I reviewed my list one more time, checking the order in which I would make the calls. I would start with the people I expected the least from and work my way toward those I hoped might surprise me. By the end of the week, I would know exactly who deserved a place in my new life. As I prepared for bed, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of me hoped I was wrong about my family, that they would rally around me in my supposed time of need. But a larger part of me was preparing for the confirmation of suspicions I'd carried for years. Tomorrow, the experiment would begin. Tomorrow, I would discover the truth about the people I'd spent my life trying to please. Monday morning arrived with a mix of dread and determination. I had called in sick to work again, claiming a stomach bug that would give me the privacy I needed to make my calls. My hands shook as I dialed the first number on my list. I decided to start with Dad, figuring his predictable response would help me get into character for the more challenging conversations ahead. "Emma, what's wrong?" "You sound upset," Dad said, after I greeted him with a deliberately strained voice. I launched into my prepared story about Creative Solutions Agency closing, the lawsuit, the missing final paycheck. As I spoke, I could almost hear him shifting into lecture mode, the same tone he'd used when I was 12 and had lost my allowance money. Well, this is exactly why I've always told you to keep 6 months of expenses saved, he began, before I'd even finished explaining my situation. And working for such a small company was always risky. You should have been looking for something more stable years ago. When I finally managed to ask for the $4,500, there was a long pause. Emma, Sarah, and I are really focused on our retirement planning right now. We can't afford to dip into those funds. But this might actually be a blessing in disguise, a chance for you to reassess your career choices and find something with better security. He offered to help me update my resume and suggested I consider moving to a cheaper apartment. Not once did he offer any actual financial assistance. After hanging up, I noted his response: concern for his own financial security, lectures about my life choices, and zero willingness to help. Next, I called Ashley. Her initial reaction was much more sympathetic, full of gasps and oh no responses as I described my situation. For a moment, I felt hopeful. That's absolutely terrible, Emma. I can't believe they can just close like that and not pay people. She sounded genuinely upset on my behalf. Have you looked into unemployment benefits? What about that savings account you mentioned last year? I explained that unemployment would take weeks to process and that my savings had been depleted by unexpected dental work. When I asked for help with the $4,500, her tone shifted subtly. Oh, Emma, I wish I could help more, but we just put the boys in that private soccer league, and the fees are astronomical. Plus, Chris and I are really trying to beef up their college funds while we can. She paused. Maybe you could stay with Mom and Michael for a while. That would save on rent. The suggestion stung. Ashley, who spent more on her monthly house cleaning service than I was asking to borrow, couldn't spare $4,500 to keep her sister housed. I thanked her for the suggestion and promised to consider it, though we both knew I wouldn't. Brandon was next, and his response was perhaps the most infuriating because it was so predictable. I'd barely finished explaining my situation when he jumped in with his own problems. God, that sucks, Em. You know, I'm actually in a really tight spot myself right now. The transmission in my truck is going out, and I'm already behind on my credit card payments from that Vegas trip. He continued for 10 minutes about his own financial struggles, never once acknowledging that I was asking for help. When I finally managed to interject and specifically request the loan, he said, "Man, I would totally help if I could, but I'm basically broke until my next few paychecks come in. Maybe try Mom? She and Michael are doing pretty well these days." The irony wasn't lost on me that Brandon, who still owed me money from 3 previous loans, was now directing me to ask other family members for help. Mom's call was scheduled for Tuesday, and her response fell exactly where I'd predicted. She expressed concern and sympathy, but when I mentioned needing $4,500, she immediately became defensive. "Oh, honey, Michael and I just aren't in a position to help with that much right now. We're still paying off the kitchen renovation, and you know how careful Michael is with our budget." She paused. "Have you asked your father? Or Ashley? She and Chris are doing so well financially." The familiar pattern was emerging. Everyone assumed someone else would help, using other family members' perceived wealth as an excuse for their own inaction. Mom offered to let me move back home temporarily, but the suggestion came with a lecture about learning to live within my means. Uncle Kevin's response was brief and dismissive. "Sorry, kiddo, but construction work has been slow, and I'm barely covering my own bills. Maybe try one of your fancy college friends." The comment about my fancy college friends revealed exactly how he saw me, as someone who had more opportunities and resources than I actually possessed. Wednesday brought calls to Aunt Patricia and my step-parents. Patricia's response was the most genuine so far, full of real concern and empathy. As a single mother, she understood financial insecurity in a way the others didn't. "Emma, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I know how scary it is to face losing your home." She sighed heavily. I wish I could help with the full amount, but with 3 kids and my teacher's salary, I just don't have that kind of money available. I could maybe manage $300 if that would help at all." Her offer, while small, felt more generous than all the others combined because I knew it represented a real sacrifice for her. I thanked her sincerely and told her to keep her money for her own children, but her willingness to help at all, despite having the least to give, spoke volumes. Michael's response was coldly practical. "Emma, I'm sorry about your job situation, but Linda and I have our own financial goals to consider. Perhaps this is an opportunity for you to develop better budgeting skills." Sarah was even worse, suggesting that I should have seen this coming and prepared better. "The writing was probably on the wall at that company for months. You should have been job hunting already." By Thursday, I had contacted everyone on my list except Tyler. His response came via text message. "Sucks about the job. Can't help with money right now, but maybe we could grab drinks this weekend?" The casual dismissal in a text message was somehow worse than the phone rejections. At least the others had pretended to care during our conversations. As I sat in my apartment Thursday evening, reviewing my notes from each conversation, the pattern was unmistakable. 7 family members had been approached for help. 5 had offered nothing but advice and lectures. 1 had offered a token amount she couldn't afford. None had stepped up in any meaningful way. The emotional toll was heavier than I'd anticipated. Even though I'd expected these responses, experiencing them firsthand was devastating. These were people who had borrowed money from me repeatedly over the years, who called me when they needed emotional support or practical help, who claimed to love me unconditionally. Yet when I needed them, they had all found reasons to say no. Worse, several had made me feel guilty for even asking, as if needing help was a character flaw rather than a temporary crisis. I spent that evening thinking about the contrast between their responses and my own behavior over the years. When Brandon needed money for rehab, I'd emptied my savings account without hesitation. When Ashley needed help with her wedding costs, I'd put thousands on my credit cards. When Dad needed help with storm damage to his roof, I'd sent what I could immediately. I had never asked them to justify their need or lectured them about financial responsibility. I had simply helped, because that's what family was supposed to do. But apparently, that philosophy only worked in one direction. The experiment had confirmed my worst fears about my family dynamics, but it had also revealed something important about myself. I had been enabling their selfishness for years, always available to help, but never expecting the same in return. I had trained them to see me as a resource rather than a person deserving of support. As I prepared for bed that Thursday night, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. The lottery money sitting in my trust accounts suddenly felt like more than just financial security. It represented the power to choose who deserved a place in my new life, based on who they really were, rather than who I hoped they might be. Tomorrow I would make one final call, to the one person I hadn't contacted yet. Deep down, I hoped she might be different, though I tried to keep my expectations realistic. After a week of disappointments, I wasn't sure I could handle one more rejection from someone I genuinely cared about. Friday morning came with an unexpected phone call that changed everything. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my notes from the week of rejections, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't expected to see. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, my elderly neighbor from across the hall. "Emma, dear, I hope I'm not calling too early," came her gentle voice. "I heard from Patricia about your job situation. She's worried about you." My heart sank. Aunt Patricia had been telling people about my supposed crisis. I braced myself for another lecture, or well-meaning but useless advice. "Oh, Mrs. Hayes, you didn't need to call. I'm managing okay," I said, trying to keep the weariness out of my voice. "Nonsense. I know what it's like to face uncertainty alone." Her voice carried a warmth that I hadn't heard from my own family all week. Patricia mentioned you might need some financial help to get through this rough patch. I was confused. Mrs. Hayes was 78 years old, living on a fixed income from her late husband's pension. She drove a car older than mine and frequently used coupons at the grocery store. Why was she calling about my financial situation? That's very kind of you to be concerned, but I couldn't possibly. Emma, she interrupted gently, I'd like to help. Could we meet for coffee this afternoon? There's something I want to discuss with you. We met at a small cafe near our apartment building. Mrs. Hayes arrived carrying a worn leather purse and wearing a simple blue cardigan that I'd seen her in dozens of times. As we settled into a corner booth, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. I want you to have this, she said, sliding it across the table. I opened the envelope and nearly gasped. Inside were 45 crisp $100 bills. $4,500. The exact amount I had been asking my family for all week. Mrs. Hayes, I can't accept this. This is too much money. You're on a fixed income. She held up her hand. Let me tell you something, dear. My Harold left me more comfortable than people think. We were careful with money our whole lives, and I have more than enough for my needs. Her eyes twinkled. What I don't have much of is family who would do what you did for me last winter. I stared at her, confused. What I did? When I fell and broke my wrist, you took care of everything. You drove me to all my doctor appointments, did my grocery shopping, picked up my prescriptions. You even stayed overnight the first few days to make sure I was okay. She reached across the table and patted my hand. You never asked for anything in return. You just helped because it was the right thing to do. The memory came flooding back. Mrs. Hayes had slipped on ice outside our building in January. I had heard her fall and rushed to help. For the next 6 weeks, while her wrist healed, I had essentially become her caretaker. I had never thought of it as anything extraordinary. She was my neighbor, and she needed help. That was just being neighborly, I said quietly. No, dear. It was being family. Real family. The kind that shows up without being asked and helps without keeping score. She smiled. When Patricia told me you were in trouble, I didn't hesitate. This is what you do for people you care about. Tears filled my eyes as the contrast hit me like a physical blow. This woman, who wasn't related to me by blood, who owed me nothing, had given me more help and kindness in one afternoon than my entire family had offered all week. She had seen my need and responded immediately, without conditions or lectures. I don't know what to say, I whispered. Say you'll accept it. And say you'll let me know if you need anything else while you're looking for work. She squeezed my hand. We look after each other, Emma. That's what real family does. That evening, I sat in my apartment holding the envelope and thinking about the profound difference between Mrs. Hayes's response and my family's reactions. She had given me exactly what I needed without hesitation, while people who shared my DNA had found countless reasons to say no. The experiment had revealed something I hadn't expected to discover. Family wasn't about blood relations or shared history. It was about showing up for each other, especially when it was inconvenient or costly. I called Jessica and told her about Mrs. Hayes's incredible generosity, though I still kept the lottery secret. She barely knows me, I said, but she was willing to give me her life savings to help. That's not her life savings, Emma, Jessica said gently. That's love in action. And maybe you barely know each other, but she's been watching you for months. She's seen who you really are. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I called Mrs. Hayes and asked if I could come over. When she opened her door, I was carrying a bottle of wine and my laptop. Mrs. Hayes, I need to tell you something important. Something that's going to sound impossible. As we sat in her cozy living room, Surrounded by photos of her late husband and decades of memories, I told her the truth. All of it. The lottery win, the secret trust, the family experiment, and her role as the only person who had truly shown up for me. Her eyes widened as I spoke, but she listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Oh my," she finally said. "That's quite a secret to carry alone." She looked at me with concern. "How are you handling all of this?" "Not very well," I admitted. "I thought the money would solve my problems, but it's created new ones. I don't know who to trust anymore." Mrs. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Money doesn't change who people are, dear. It just reveals who they were all along." She paused. "But it sounds like you learned something valuable about your family this week." "I learned that they're not really my family at all," I said bitterly. "No," she said gently. "You learned that family is something you choose, not something you're born into. And you've been choosing your family all along. You just didn't realize it." She was right. I had been building a chosen family without consciously recognizing it. Mrs. Hayes, Jessica, even Frank at the corner store who always asked about my day, these were the people who had shown up consistently in my life. "You gonna do now?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "I'm going to stop pretending that blood makes someone family. I'm going to invest in the relationships that are real and stop trying to fix the ones that are broken." I looked at her seriously. "And I want to make sure you're taken care of for the rest of your life. You're the closest thing to a grandmother I've ever had." Mrs. Hayes's eyes filled with tears. "Emma, I don't need your money. I need your friendship. That's worth more than all the lottery winnings in the world." "Then you'll have both," I said firmly, "because that's what real family does." As I walked back to my apartment that night, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The experiment had been painful, but it had given me something invaluable. Clarity about who deserved a place in my new life and who didn't. The money was still sitting in my trust accounts, but now I knew exactly how I wanted to use it. Not to fix broken relationships or buy love from people incapable of giving it, but to support and celebrate the relationships that were already real. For the first time since winning the lottery, I felt truly wealthy. The following Monday, I made a decision that had been building all weekend. I was done living a lie, but I wasn't ready to reveal the lottery win either. Instead, I would come clean about the fake crisis and confront my family about what their responses had revealed. I called each family member and invited them to a family meeting at Mom's house that Sunday, claiming I had important news to share. The curiosity in their voices was palpable. Ashley immediately asked if I had found a new job. Dad wondered if I was moving back home. Brandon, surprisingly, was the only one who sounded genuinely concerned about my well-being rather than curious about the drama. Sunday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I drove to Mom and Michael's house. I had spent the morning with Mrs. Hayes, who had insisted on making me a thermos of coffee for courage. Jessica had offered to come with me for moral support, but I knew this was something I needed to do alone. Everyone was already gathered in the living room when I arrived. Mom had made her usual spread of snacks that no one would touch, and the tension in the room was thick. Ashley sat with Chris on the sectional, checking her phone periodically. Dad and Sarah occupied the matching recliners, while Michael hovered near the kitchen doorway as if planning his escape route. Brandon sprawled across the love seat, and Uncle Kevin sat stiffly in a dining room chair that had been brought in for extra seating. Tyler had actually shown up, which surprised me, slouching in the corner and occasionally scrolling through his phone. "Well," Mom said with forced cheerfulness as I settled into the remaining chair, "you certainly have us all curious. Please tell me you found a job." I took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of people I had spent my life trying to please. Actually, I never lost my job. Creative Solutions Agency is doing fine. I made up the entire story about the company closing. The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley's mouth fell open. Dad's expression darkened immediately. Mom looked confused, as if she couldn't process what I had just said. "What do you mean you made it up?" Ashley finally asked, her voice rising slightly. "I mean, I lied to all of you. I created a fake financial crisis to see who would actually help me if I needed it." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "Last week, I asked each of you for help with $4,500, claiming I was about to lose my apartment. That's—" Dad started, then stopped, his face reddening. "That's manipulative and dishonest, Emma. Why would you do such a thing?" "Because I wanted to know who would be there for me when I actually needed help, instead of just when you need something from me." I turned to look at him directly. "And your response, Dad, was to lecture me about financial responsibility while refusing to help." Sarah straightened in her chair. "We're not obligated to bail you out of poor financial planning." "Even when it's fake poor financial planning?" I interrupted. "Even when your daughter is supposedly about to become homeless?" The room erupted in defensive voices. Ashley protested that she had offered to let me stay with them, conveniently forgetting that she had suggested I move in with Mom instead. Michael muttered something about setting boundaries with adult children. Tyler, surprisingly, remained silent, looking uncomfortable for the first time since I'd known him. "This is ridiculous," Brandon said, though his voice lacked the righteous indignation of the others. "You can't test people like that." "Can I?" I stood up, suddenly feeling calmer than I had all week. "In the last 5 years, I've lent money to almost everyone in this room. Brandon, I've given you over $8,000 for various emergencies. Ashley, I put $3,000 on my credit cards for your wedding. Dad, I sent you $1,500 when your roof leaked." I continued down the list, watching their faces as I recounted specific amounts and occasions. But when I supposedly needed help, suddenly everyone had excuses. Everyone had better things to do with their money. "That's different," Mom said weakly. "Those were real emergencies." "And my fake emergency wasn't convincing enough?" "I was supposedly about to lose my home, but that wasn't urgent enough for any of you to prioritize?" I shook my head. The only difference was that this time, I was the one asking instead of giving. Uncle Kevin finally spoke up. "So what was the point of all this? To make us feel guilty?" "The point was to understand who my real family is," I said simply. "And I learned something important. It's not any of you." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I could see the shock and hurt on some faces, anger on others. But for the first time in years, I felt completely honest with them. "That's a terrible thing to say," Ashley said, tears forming in her eyes. "We're your family whether you like it or not." "No," I said gently. "You're my relatives. Family is the people who show up for each other, who help without keeping score, who care about your well-being even when it's inconvenient." I thought about Mrs. Hayes sitting in her apartment, probably reading her book and waiting to hear how this went. Family is what you choose, not what you're born into. Dad stood up abruptly. "This is enough. You've made your point, Emma. You think we're all terrible people because we didn't fall for your elaborate lie." "I think you're people who take more than you give," I corrected. "And now I know that for certain, instead of just suspecting it." The meeting dissolved into arguments and hurt feelings. Some family members tried to justify their responses. Others accused me of being unfair and manipulative. A few, like Tyler and surprisingly Brandon, remained mostly quiet, looking thoughtful rather than defensive. As people began to leave, making uncomfortable goodbyes and avoiding eye contact, I felt a strange sense of relief. The pretense was finally over. I no longer had to wonder about the true nature of these relationships, or feel guilty about my growing resentment toward people who consistently disappointed me. Ashley was the last to leave, lingering in the doorway while Chris waited in the car. "Emma, I know you're hurt, but this isn't going to fix anything. You can't just cut off your family." "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said. "I'm just being honest about what these relationships really are. We can still have holiday dinners and exchange birthday cards, but I'm done pretending we're close when we're not." She left looking confused and hurt, and I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty about it. The truth was often painful, but it was also liberating. Mom walked me to my car, her face troubled. "Emma, honey, I know we haven't always been perfect, but we do love you." "I know you love me in your way," I replied. "But love isn't just a feeling, Mom. It's actions. It's showing up when someone needs you, even when it's inconvenient." I hugged her briefly. "I hope someday you'll understand why I needed to do this." As I drove home through the Denver streets, I felt lighter than I had in months. The family meeting had been difficult, but it had accomplished something important. I had spoken my truth without anger or bitterness, simply stating facts about behavior and patterns that had been evident for years. The lottery money was still my secret, and I intended to keep it that way. But now I knew exactly who deserved to benefit from my good fortune and who didn't. More importantly, I knew who I could count on to be my real family going forward. Mrs. Hayes was waiting for me when I got home, as I had suspected she would be. She had made dinner and set 2 places at her small dining table. "How did it go, dear?" she asked as she served homemade soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. "Better than expected," I said honestly. I told them the truth about the fake crisis. They weren't happy about it, but I think I got my point across. "And how do you feel about it all?" I considered the question as I tasted her soup, which was better than anything my biological family had ever made for me. "Free," I said finally. "I feel free." 2 years later, my life was unrecognizable from that anxious March evening when I first discovered those winning numbers. I was sitting in the sunroom of my new house, a modest but beautiful craftsman-style home in a quiet Denver neighborhood, watching Mrs. Hayes tend to the garden we had planted together in the shared backyard space between our properties. Yes, Mrs. Hayes lived next door again. When I had decided to move from my Capitol Hill apartment, I made sure to find a house with a small guest cottage on the property. Mrs. Hayes now lived there rent-free, with her medical expenses covered by a trust I had established. To her, it seemed like a generous arrangement between friends. She had no idea that her friend was secretly managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio. My foundation, Second Family Services, had grown beyond anything I had imagined when I first started planning it. We provided support services for elderly people who were isolated from their biological families, helping with everything from home maintenance to medical advocacy to simply providing companionship. The work was deeply fulfilling in a way my corporate graphic design career had never been. Jessica had joined the organization as our community outreach coordinator, bringing her social work expertise and compassionate nature to our mission. She still didn't know about the lottery win, believing instead that I had received a large inheritance from a distant relative, which wasn't entirely untrue if you considered luck a distant relative. "You know what still amazes me?" Jessica said one evening as we reviewed applications for our newest program, which provided small home modifications for aging in place. "How you've managed to build something this substantial from your inheritance. Most people would have just bought a bigger apartment and called it a day." I smiled thinking about how different my life could have been if I had revealed the lottery win immediately after that family confrontation. "I learned something important about money," I said. "It's not about what you can buy for yourself. It's about what you can build for others." The foundation had helped over 800 seniors in the Denver metro area, connecting them with resources, services, and most importantly, genuine human connection. We had a team of 12 employees now, all passionate about our mission of creating chosen families for people whose biological families had failed them. My relationship with my biological family had settled into something more honest, if distant. We exchanged holiday cards and maintained polite contact, but the pretense of closeness had been permanently lifted. Occasionally, one of them would reach out when they needed something, but I had learned to say no without guilt. The most surprising development had been with Tyler. About 6 months after the family confrontation, he had called me and asked to meet for coffee. I had expected another request for money, or perhaps an attempt to guilt me into reconciling with the family. Instead, he apologized. "I've been thinking about what you said that day," he told me as we sat in the same cafe where I'd once met with Mrs. Hayes, about how family should show up for each other. And I realized I've never really shown up for anyone, including myself. Tyler had used my experiment as a wake-up call to examine his own life and relationships. He had started therapy, found a steady job, and begun making amends to people he had let down over the years. We now had coffee every few months, building a genuine friendship based on mutual respect rather than obligation. "You were right to call us out," he said during one of our recent meetings. "We treated you like a convenience rather than a person. I'm sorry it took your fake crisis to make me see that." Brandon had reached out once, about a year after the confrontation, when he was going through another financial crisis. But instead of asking for money, he had asked for advice about getting help for his gambling problem. I had connected him with resources and offered emotional support, which felt like a healthier dynamic than our previous relationship. The rest of the family had moved on with their lives, seemingly unbothered by the reduced contact. Ashley occasionally posted passive-aggressive social media updates about the importance of forgiveness and family loyalty, but she had never directly addressed our conversation. Dad and Sarah continued their successful real estate ventures, and Mom and Michael seemed content with their renovated kitchen and periodic updates about my foundation work. None of them knew about the lottery money, and I intended to keep it that way. On several occasions, family members had faced genuine crises where anonymous help had appeared. When Uncle Kevin was injured on a construction site and faced mounting medical bills, the hospital mysteriously received an anonymous donation to cover his expenses. When Aunt Patricia's car broke down and she couldn't afford repairs, a local mechanic received payment from an anonymous Good Samaritan to fix her vehicle. They never suspected the source of these gifts, and I preferred it that way. I could help when help was genuinely needed, without the complications that would arise from them knowing about my wealth. Mrs. Hayes and I had developed a beautiful routine. We shared dinner at least 3 times a week, alternating between her cottage and my main house. She had become the grandmother I had never really had, offering wisdom and unconditional support that felt entirely different from the conditional love I had experienced with my biological family. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she said one evening as we sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. "How different your life would be if you had told everyone about the lottery money right away." I had eventually told her the full truth about the lottery win, needing at least one person to know the complete story. Her reaction had been characteristically wise and measured. "They would have suddenly become very interested in my well-being," I replied, sipping the tea she had made us, "and I never would have known who really cared about me." Exactly. That experiment, painful as it was, gave you something invaluable: clarity. She reached over and patted my hand. "You learned that love isn't about blood relationships or shared history. It's about choosing to show up for each other, day after day." The money had allowed me to build a life aligned with my values rather than my fears. I no longer worried about rent or medical bills or car repairs. But more importantly, I no longer worried about disappointing people who were incapable of appreciating my efforts. I had reconnected with my artistic side, converting one room of my house into a studio where I painted whenever I needed to process emotions or simply create beauty. Some of my work now hung in the foundation offices, and I had even sold a few pieces to local galleries, though the income was negligible compared to my lottery winnings. The greatest lesson I had learned was not about money or family, but about self-worth. Before the lottery, I had defined my value by what I could give to others, constantly trying to earn love through sacrifice and generosity. I had allowed myself to be used because I believed that was what love required. Now I understood that real love, the kind Mrs. Hayes and Jessica had shown me, didn't keep a balance sheet. It gave freely without expectation of return, but it also respected boundaries and dignity. It was honest and consistent, present in good times and bad. The lottery win had been life-changing, but not in the ways I had initially feared or hoped. It had simply given me the freedom to see clearly and choose wisely. The most valuable thing I had gained wasn't the millions in my investment accounts. It was the understanding that my worth wasn't determined by what I could give to others, but by who I chose to be and who I chose to surround myself with. As Mrs. Hayes and I finished our tea and prepared to go inside for the evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From the shock of those matching numbers, to the pain of family rejection, to the joy of building something meaningful with unexpected fortune, every step had led me to this moment of quiet contentment. The money had changed my life, yes, but not because it had bought me things. It had bought me truth, and truth had set me free to build a life worthy of the person I wanted to be. "Thank you," I said to Mrs. Hayes as she gathered our cups. "For what, dear?" "For showing me what real family looks like." She smiled and kissed my forehead, the way I imagined a real grandmother would. "Thank you for choosing me right back." Have you ever had to test someone's loyalty in your life? What did you learn about the people around you when you needed help the most? Share your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most painful truths lead to the most beautiful transformations. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe for more real-life lessons about relationships, money, and finding your true family. Remember, your worth isn't determined by what you can give to others, but by the love and respect you choose to surround yourself with.